Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Welcome to this midweek edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyam Vogo, and on the show tonight, more trouble for the South African consumer as inflation hits a 13-year high. Former Health Minister Zweli Mkhize's supporters up the ante following the outcome of a health department's disciplinary process. The DC fingers departmental officials but is silence on him. But is that enough to pave the way for him to challenge ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa in December? That's the question we are asking tonight.
I had difficulty in both witnesses who have heard. The one was part of the so-called rogue element. You could see that there are gray areas.
MPs pause to take stock as the inquiry into the fitness to hold office by suspended public protector advocate Busiwe Mkhwebane temporarily adjourns. We interrogate some of the concerns that have been raised about the process thus far. All that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. Consumer inflation has continued its upward trajectory, reaching a 13-year high of 7.4% in June from 6.5% in May. The main drivers were food, fuel, and housing and utilities. Inflation is way above the Reserve Bank target bracket of 3 to 6% for the second consecutive month.
The cost of living in South Africa continues to increase. The basket of goods that an average South African uses costs 7.4% more compared to the same time last year. The main drivers of consumer price inflation are food, fuel and utilities. Fuel prices have been going up for a few months, with the litre of petrol increasing by 233 cents in June, pushing the price of a litre of petrol to 24.17 cents in Gauteng. Housing and utilities costs increased by an annual 5.1%.
Indeed, this is quite negative news, especially given that both food and fuel prices, that are the two items that's the biggest in terms of weighting of the low-income group in South Africa, both of those are rising at significant numbers, way above the average inflation even. We're looking at food inflation now sitting at 9%. Your public transport inflation is around 14%, and your overall fuel price inflation is around 45%. So indeed, it's hard times for everybody in South Africa, and in particular the low-income group.
The high inflation environment will likely translate to the Reserve Bank hiking interest rates again in a bid to cap inflation. Economists expect a 50 basis points increase, but they're not ruling out a higher increase.
So we think we're probably going to see a 50 basis point hike. We don't think the Reserve Bank's necessarily going to have to follow the Federal Reserve Bank Open Market Committee and hike by 75 basis points as it has recently. And of course, however, there is still a risk that we do see that significantly higher move, the 75 basis points instead of the 50 basis point move.
Economists warn that the interest rate hikes, while necessary, will reduce the spending power of consumers, dampening the already weak economic growth prospects. Gloria Safakomosi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
We're now joined by chartered accountant and commentator Kaya Stola. Good evening, Kaya. Thank you so much for your time this evening. The worst news we would have expected or wanted to hear.
Definitely, and good evening to the viewers. I think obviously the reality here is that for as long as the war in the Ukraine, for example, persists, we know very well that oil prices are going to be quite volatile and are also going to be on the high end. And of course, oil prices are relevant in particular because fuel is one of those cross-cutting expenses that affects everyone in one form or another. So whether you're even looking at the price of food for now, you can imagine that the logistics associated with the loaf of bread that ends up at your table cannot be insulated from the fuel prices, and everything else that you have to acquire as a citizen is intrinsically linked to the question of the fuel price. And as you can see clearly over the past year, that has been the one runaway input into inflation that has had enormous consequences for all citizens. If you did a desktop calculation, which I tried to do earlier on, by this time last year, the dollar price of, Brent crude was only $69, and the exchange rate in South Africa was 14 rand to the dollar. In other words, if South Africa was buying one barrel just at that exit price, you would have paid 966 rand. As of today, that same barrel will cost 1,830 rand. So you can imagine what the impact would have been on every other part of the economy that is influenced by fuel prices.
Mm-hmm. Of course, we know what the combination of these price hikes, whether you're talking about oils, fats, whether you're talking about transport, taxi fares, bus fares, weather, and all those things on the poorer sections of our population, especially, but the middle classes aren't off the hook either. I mean, the devastation is going to be felt there as well.
Yeah, the devastation is definitely cross-cutting, because I think generally what tends to happen during times of economic crisis, people would say, look, I can migrate up and down the value chain. So if I was buying a loaf of white bread, which is relatively more expensive yesterday, I can switch to a loaf of brown bread today, which is relatively cheaper. But unfortunately, a lot of us are running out of that space of negotiation, because even that loaf of brown bread, which is relatively cheaper, is now so ridiculously expensive, you are stuck with it. So it's not just an issue affecting the lower income citizens anymore. It's an issue that is so cross-cutting. Everybody is affected, and the middle class in particular are definitely feeling the squeeze. And of course, you want them to be the ones that become the bulk of our tax contributions and be the ones that become the engine drivers of the economy. And unfortunately, they are suffering just like everybody else.
And they're the ones, of course, with bonds, paying off car installments, taking children to, schools that ask for more monies, and so on.
Yeah, and obviously that exposure to the credit market is particularly amplified amongst the middle class. And of course, as you can imagine, that the Reserve Bank, its response rate is to say, one of the ways in which you can protect the currency is to respond to these inflation numbers by increasing the repo rate, which is what we expect them to do tomorrow. Now, unfortunately, the unintended and most direct consequence of that is that those that owe a financial institution, for example, would obviously end up paying a bit more at the end of the month, which anecdotally sounds, self-defeating and counterintuitive, because if the starting point is to say that people are squeezed, while raising interest rates puts a greater squeeze. But unfortunately, the monetary policy instruments that we have at our disposal only can work in that way.
Well, analysts have been talking about 50 basis points. What we heard today change whatever they may have been thinking or considering already? What's the likelihood of today's numbers actually persuading them to be even a lot more tough
aggressive
than perhaps they would have been? Yeah.
I do think that today's numbers probably also shocked the Reserve Bank itself, because they work on long-term estimates and forecasts, and they would have worked on the hope that we'll probably come in at a much lower number than what we've come in on. We also know that they've historically operated on a target range, which is to say between 3 and 6%, that's their zone of comfort. Now, obviously, since we've been breaking that ceiling in the past few months, it has meant that anecdotally, they should be a bit more amplified or a bit more aggressive in their response if they had to stick to that particular principle. So, of course, today's data will probably persuade a couple of MPC members to ask the difficult question of whether tomorrow's number should be a bit more aggressive, because if we stick to the 50 basis points tomorrow, it still unfortunately will mean we are in negative real interest rates. In other words, the inflation rate will still be higher than the repo rate. So the difficult question will be, if your intention is to sort of get some element of parity in one way or another between those two numbers, why would you hold back on an opportunity to be a bit more aggressive tomorrow?
Is there any magic, in that 3 to 6% bracket?
I think it's been the guiding light for how South Africa and the Reserve Bank have managed its monetary policy for many years. It isn't by any stretch of the imagination a gospel number. However, what it does is that it enables those that want to engage in long-term planning, like the Reserve Bank itself, like the investor community, to sort of predict with an element of, comfort what might happen. So that's what it does. It sort of gives that sense of comfort, because we sort of know that under these particular circumstances, this is what's likely to happen. The risk with the markets being too volatile, in other words, people not being in a position to sort of estimate how the Reserve Bank might operate or how it might react to market conditions, is that people are unlikely to then stay away from participating in that economy because, well, if you think that the Reserve Bank is going to act in a particular way next week and then they act in a completely different way, it then changes the fundamentals or the basis for the investment decisions that you've made. So we definitely do want some element of predictability and some element of certainty. And historically, the Reserve Bank has used that 3 to 6% as a guideline, but it isn't a number that is anchored in any gospel truth. It is something that is occasionally interrogated. The Reserve Bank governor has indeed even entertained the idea of having a singular number rather than a range, but that is a conversation that is still ongoing within the Monetary Policy Committee members.
But how important is predictability? In other words, I mean, apart from the fact that it then, gives you and I a sense, of what could happen. Is there another value that predictability has?
Yeah. So the one useful thing about an element of predictability is that, unfortunately, some of the key instruments that we need in order to really turn this economy around are linked to long-term investment and are linked to long-term projects. So as you would have heard, for example, one of the articles that came out this week was to say that some of the independent power producer projects are now faced the risk of no longer being economically feasible. In other words, at the point in time when people say, look, if Eskom is going to pay that particular tariff and it's going to cost me so much to put up this particular plant, then therefore I'm going to do it. So if it turns out that you no longer have the ability to actually predict what the long-term trends are going to be, it will mean that a lot of potential infrastructure investments quite simply do not happen because nobody is going to be able to say, actually, I think this is how much we're going to generate from this particular project. So therefore, let us go and open up that factory. So it unfortunately has a lot of domino effects on the economy at large when people do not sort of have a zone of certainty around what might happen given a particular set of economic fundamentals.
Elsewhere in the world where people think, what's the word to use? I'll use the word we'll often use, where people think out of the box, or are not as, conservative or set, in their rules as we are or tend to be. What do people do sometimes in situations like these, where something extraordinary happens? It's beyond what you would have predicted. What are the sort of things or levers that other people have to then try and deal with a situation like we are facing right now?
I would say the most important instrument is some form of coordination between your monetary policy instruments and your fiscal policy instruments. Fiscal policy instruments, for example, if you remember what happened in 2008 in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there was obviously a global recession, but South Africa was able to sort of recover from that a bit faster on the basis that we already had a big infrastructure drive that was happening ahead of the 2010 FIFA World Cup. Now, of course, a big infrastructure drive of that nature is a fiscal policy deliberation. It's government saying that we want to put so much into the economy in order to accelerate X, Y, Z. So unfortunately, since then, South Africa, for example, has seen its debt to GDP ratio move from 27% as it was at the end of 2008 to 70% now, which means that even if we said that the solution to dealing with this economic flux is for us to put a bit more into the economy, to spend a bit more, the ability to borrow has now completely diminished on the basis that we've borrowed too much over the past 13 years, for example. So if you are able to get that sense of coordination between your monetary policy instruments and your fiscal policy instruments, then you sort of buy yourself a much bigger negotiating a room around what can be done and what should be done. You'd have heard in countries like the United States, for example, they've then decided that they want to have a big infrastructure spend. They're trying to put together a lot of money back into the economy because the way they've managed their economy gives them the breathing space to do that. In South Africa, we unfortunately have squeezed ourselves so much over the past 13 to 14 years. It is not as easy to be able to say, let us look at alternative ways of getting things done, which is why we feel a bit squeezed. You also would remember, Vuyo, that the current president has been on a big infrastructure drive since 2018, where he's been appealing to various investors across the globe to come invest in South Africa, and we've called it the infrastructure drive. Now, unfortunately, it is difficult to imagine that anyone is going to justify an investment in long-term infrastructure if they can't get access to electricity, for example, and if they can't get access to the rails because Transnet is unable to execute on its primary mandate. So all of those issues, best intentions withstanding, it's just very difficult to see a short-term solution for South Africa.
Kaya Sole, let me thank you so much for your time and for your insights this evening. Content and commentator Kaya Stolet helping us make sense of the developments that we saw today. Well, up next, former Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize's supporters are upping the ante following the outcome of a Health Department disciplinary process that fingers departmental officials but is silent on him. What does that mean? That's what we're looking into up next. Former Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize's supporters are upping the ante following the outcome of a Health Department disciplinary process. That disciplinary process fingers departmental officials and makes findings on them, but is silent on him. The question we're asking, Chad, is whether that is enough to pave the way for him to challenge ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa in December, given what his supporters are already saying right now that, well, there's a report. It's not saying anything about him. So can we please move? Because our person, we want our person to challenge President Cyril Ramaphosa come December. Of course, that doesn't depend on this particular disciplinary process that we are talking about. It depends also on what the SIU feeding into the NPA and where there's a case that can come before the courts and so on. But we're focusing narrowly this evening on the outcome of the disciplinary process of the National Health Department and, of course, the calls that are beginning to come out, especially as we go to that provincial, KwaZulu-Natal Provincial ANC conference that's taking place this weekend. It's also important because it is there that you're probably going to get more and more noises, or the noises are going to get louder and calls are going to be made for Dr. Zweli Mkhize to take on Cyril Ramaphosa come December. Let's now give you a bit of context. What happened? What happened with the Digital Vibes saga and what then subsequently led to the disciplinary process that I have just mentioned. Charges or allegations were made against several officials of the National Department. Three of them in the main. We're talking about Dr. Anban Pillay, we're talking about Shrerin Padesi, and we're also talking about Popo Maja. What were the charges? The charges were that they failed to apply the required evaluation criteria correctly, fairly and consistently, which resulted in brand swell being unfairly and incorrectly eliminated from the evaluation process, which then led to Digital Vibes being the only remaining bidder. Secondly, the allegation was that they willfully and intentionally, alternatively grossly, negligently, through their conduct, caused the National Department of Health to incur fruitless and wasteful expenditure, in that Brandswell's bid price was approximately 51.606% cheaper than Digital Vibes, and the amount paid to Digital Vibes would have been proportionately less if the tender was awarded to rival Brandswell. So those were the charges that were leveled against the three officials as they went into that DC. So the DC looked at all these allegations, a hearing then was undertaken. But there's an important aspect to this. Ahead of that, there was an agreement that whatever the department was going to enter into conversations with the people who have been implicated, who were going to go through this disciplinary process. And if between the department and these officials and whoever else is involved, there's an agreement as to the sanction at the end of the day, that will be negotiated between the relevant parties, and whatever they come up with at the end of the day, and this is important, whatever they come up with at the end of the day will then constitute the sanction finally. Okay? I hope we're still together so far. Let's look at Dr. Pillay as a start. He has then since been found guilty of intentionally permitting the service level agreement. This is now the service level agreement with Digital Vibes to include two provisions that were not supposed to be there. The provisions were Digital Vibes was getting 2.5 million rands a month, even if it did nothing. 2.5 million, they gave me an invoice. At the end of it, they get 2.5 million. And this was going on for 3 months. So from where the presiding officer of the disciplinary hearing said this was in breach of the BAC code, Dr. Pillay was part of that arrangement, and his duty of good faith to the employer. So that's a negative finding against Dr. Pillay. But the presiding officer's report also says something very interesting, that it shows unequivocally that a predetermined outcome on the part of the department's officials, or at the very least on the part of Dr. Pillay, to appoint Ms. Mather. Now, Ms. Mather, you will recall, is the person who headed Digital Vibes, and the person allegedly a friend and close confidant and other things of Dr. Zweli Mkhize. Let's move to the second person, Sherin Padesi. She too negligently signed the service level agreement and thus acted in breach of the BAC code and her duty of good faith to the employer. Popo Maja, who was the spokesperson of the department and also sat on the committee that decided to give this to Digital Vibes. He too was negligent in the management of the service level agreement with Digital Vibe. But there's a rider to this. The presiding officer said he is, however, unable on the evidence to find that he acted with intention or dishonestly. So, negative findings on the three people. But then the presiding officer also says that Digital Vibes was not exceptional or outstanding as these people and those who joined them in the decision-making sought to contend. It also says that these three, their prior knowledge concerning Digital Vibes may well have influenced how they changed or influence, how they discharge rather their functions. So that's a bit of a background. That's what happened, which came to the public domain a couple of days ago when the findings or the decisions of the presiding officer in the National Health Department disciplinary process concluded his business. Now, on the back of that, You now have part of Dr. Mkhize's team saying, well, the report says nothing. I mean, these people had their backs to the wall, their careers were under threat, but at no point did they even suggest that Dr. Mkhize had anything to do with Digital Vibes or the decision to give Digital Vibes the 150 million rand contract. So he's clean. And then you have those who are supporting Dr. Mkhize politically, saying, well, there have been calls in the province for Dr. Mkhize to put his name up, you know, as a challenger to Cyril Ramaphosa for the position of president of the ANC. And all of this happening literally days before the biggest province, ANC province, in South Africa goes to a crucial conference this coming weekend. And of course, KwaZulu-Natal being the home and stronghold of Dr. Zweli Mkhize. Well, I'm joined now by our analyst who's going to help us understand, or at least talk about some of these issues, the relevance of all these things I have just mentioned, and from what he knows, he's based in that province, whether he in fact does stand a chance and whether things may even pan out the way some people are beginning to say they may well do. Professor Bheki Mngomezulu is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of the Western Cape. Prof, good evening. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Mr. Mbogo, and good evening to your viewers.
A very long intro to what we are going to talk about. It probably gives us less time, but that background was, I thought, critical. Just your thoughts on what people are beginning to say now, certainly over the past couple of days, but that this is what has happened over the past few days begins, at the very least, to clear the way for Dr. Mkhize.
No, thank you very much for that question, Mr. Mbogo. You are quite right. First of all, you recall that there was a parliamentary committee that looked into the matter, basically trying to establish the extent to which Dr. Mkhize might have violated the Ethics Act which guides parliamentarians. And they cleared him from their side. But then it was made clear at the time that the parliamentary processes do not necessarily overrule what's going to happen in the legal system, basically the NPA and all the investigations that we've just referred to. So now that these investigations are starting to paint a picture that in fact the findings of the Ethics Committee might in fact have gone right, in the sense that at least for now, Dr. Mkhize has not been found guilty in as far as these particular investigations are concerned. So that will then give him more impetus to then say, now I've not been found guilty, and therefore there is nothing stopping me from contesting the position of the presidency at the ANC conference in December 2020. But the process, of course, has to start with the nominations. Once he's nominated, he accepts the nomination, then of course he can stand, because constitutionally, Mr. Mbogo, the Constitution says that you are assumed innocent until proven guilty. But the step aside the role of the ANC, there's a number of questions which the ANC itself is struggling to answer, which is why, for example, the NEC saw it necessary to amend it. But even after the amendment, there were still questions on that particular resolution, which is why Paul Mashatile just recently issued a directive to the provinces telling them that anyone who is implicated in any wrongdoing is not eligible to be nominated and then subsequently be elected, considered for election in this forthcoming conference.
But then, Prof, remember, the SIU wants the Digital Vibes contract to be set aside and other things to follow, like pay back the money and all those things. That process is still continuing. The fight a few months ago was about the documents that Dr. Mkhize said he still hadn't received to prepare adequately for his part in the case. And that case is going to continue. The SIU has made that very clear. But before you, talk about that, I also want to add that it may well be, he said, well, that's none of my business, you know. You can, ask the people who benefited. And if anything, the outcome of this disciplinary process I have just spoken about at length, you know, probably, in fact, not probably, helps the SIU because it proves in a number of ways that there was a lot wrong and irregular about the contract itself. So it plays into the hands of what the SIU has found up until now, and what, of course, the NPA will have to also prove in court. But what it doesn't do necessarily is exonerate Dr. Mkhize. We don't know what is going to come out of that court process.
You know, Mr. Mbogo, there is something very interesting with this Dr. Mkhize issue. In the first instance, anyone who understands the procurement process will tell you that the minister in any government is a political head and has nothing to do with the procurement process. So that is the point of departure. So if indeed that is the case, then the question is, how does Dr. Mkhize get involved in this whole process? In other words, how does his name get dragged in the mud, as it were, in this particular Digital Vibe issue? Unless then, of course, somebody says that he interfered with the process, which would be a valid case then, but that case too would have to be proved in court. So that is one point. But then the second point is that when he left his position as the Minister of Health, as far as I know, there was no legal charge laid against him at the time. But then, of course, he had to step aside to allow the process to unfold, which then takes me to the question that if indeed that was the case, he left even before there was a formal charge laid against him, then why do we have qualms with those who are saying that the president should do the same, because there are also issues he has to answer to, but he has not stepped aside. So that is basically the complexity of this issue, which is then why this step-aside resolution of the ANC is not received well by some factions or sections of the ANC, and in fact by some sections of the public who are not necessarily members of the ANC.
Now, I want to go back to the issue you raised right at the very beginning in this last response. You are correct. A member of the executive should have nothing to do, with contracts, the awarding of contracts and all of that. That is the rule. But we've also seen people doing things that they're not supposed to do. I'm not saying that's what he did, but we've seen that happening. We've seen throughout the state capture process that people unduly interfered and did a lot of things that, as member of the executive, all the way up to the president, they were not supposed to do. But the SIU says he may have influenced the awarding of the tender to Digital Vibes. That's what the SIU says. I'm not saying that's what happened, right? So the matter then has to come before the courts for that allegation to be tested, isn't it? Huh? So with that allegation hanging, how possible is it going to, and given the step-aside rule, is it going to be for him to be able to, and the mills tend to grind very slowly when it comes to our legal processes here. So how realistic then are his supporters in expecting that come December, this is going to happen? He will be eligible. Mr.
Mbo, I'll answer your question in a two-pronged manner. In the first instance, let us look at the statement by SIU. I'm not a first language English speaker, but I happen to understand English very well because I even studied at a university. There is a stark difference between two words, will and may. And there is also a difference between must and may. And that is the same point that I made when I was interpreting Section 194, subsection 3 of the Constitution with regards to the public protector, where it says the president may suspend either the public protector or the auditor general. But it doesn't say he must. Only in number 3 of that section does it say that once the National Assembly Committee has found that incumbent to have done something wrong, then in that case he has no choice. He must, in fact, expel that individual. Now, in this case, if the SIU says that Dr. Mkhize may have influenced the process, then the first question is, on what basis are they saying that? And are they laying a charge against him, or are they making a speculation? In other words, what informs them formulating their statement in that manner? Because they are not saying that Dr. Mkhize influenced the process. They are saying he may have influenced. So does that then warrant that he must be suspended on the basis of those allegations? That is something that is not clear to the general public out there, especially when it comes to the decision being taken by the ANC, which has a potential to prevent Dr. Mkhize from running for office. Then to answer the second part of your question, obviously, the resolution as it stands, that is the ANC resolution taken in 2017, as I said, it's confusing. It's confusing in many respects, some of which I've just outlined. And you recall what happened after the Mpumalanga ANC provincial election, and then, of course, after the eThekwini regional conference election, where Mamzandile Gumede emerged victorious. Only then did the NEC of the ANC deem it fit to amend that resolution by then trying to fill some of the gaps that were there. But even then, they failed because if they had succeeded, then it means that Paul Mashatile would have had no reason to send this directive to the provinces. So the point I'm making, therefore, is that those branches that are saying that they would like Dr. Mkhize to contest the December election, in a way they are not wrong, because there is no case against him, at least for now. Then if he's guilty of anything, let him be formally charged, and then let the resolution of the ANC, the step-aside resolution, kick in. At the moment, unless, of course, I'm missing something, but at the moment, I don't understand why Dr. Mkhize had to step aside. With Esma Khashule, they will say that there were formal charges that were laid against him. Therefore, there was a reason for him to step aside. But with Dr. Mkhize, I don't understand what happened.
Okay. Prof, we'll see how this pans out. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Professor of Political Science, who teaches political science at the University of the Western Cape. To this now, the suitability of witnesses at the parliamentary impeachment inquiry into the fitness to hold office by suspended public protector advocate Mkhwebane has come under the spotlight. Some lawmakers believe the witnesses must be credible, while others have raised concerns about the unfair treatment of other witnesses. The impeachment inquiry has set to discuss in-house matters and how the inquiry has gone too far. Listen to some of what the MPs had to say.
It's a first for the country. The removal of a head of a Chapter 9 institution is uncharted waters, and the rules of how to handle the inquiry need continuous clarity.
Your contributions and guidance is well appreciated in handling a very important, complex matter for the National Assembly. Hope that you would have been part of starting that important historical journey. But it's very clear that a week later, there might be a few things that we must attend, tighten up, or relook or rethink about.
Suspended public protector Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane faces charges of incompetence and misconduct. Some witnesses have come forward willingly or unwillingly to question some of her reports. One witness was accused of drinking whiskey while having medication, while another was accused of lying and dishonesty.
Chairperson, I want to put it on record that during the cross-examination, first of all, of Mr. van Lochrenberg, his medical status was made public for all to see. And secondly, during the cross-examination of Mr. Kekana, there were some really, really horrible insults that were hurled at Mr. Kekana, to the extent that he was called a liar, he was called dishonest, it was absolutely untenable.
The respect should be given to all of us as members of parliament, to the evidence leaders, to the witnesses, to everyone who's involved in this process. So we cannot hurl insult when we can't get our own way. And we want the chairperson to be firm also.
You bring credible witnesses. I'm not insinuating that they are not credible, but I had difficulty in both witnesses who have heard. The one was part of the so-called rogue element. You could see that there are gray areas. And also on this one, he says, no, I cannot answer you because I still have a court pending case in court.
The expert witness, there was a shortfall. Maybe we expected too much from the expert witness. We expected the expert witness to focus on what I call alternative dispute resolution.
Other members felt Mkhwebane ought to answer some questions immediately rather than defer them to written responses.
I did become concerned that we are raising questions using Rule 5.9 and accumulating a pile of questions for the public protector before she gives evidence. And some of those questions, most of them, all of them, in fact, that I would have asked, could be posed directly to the public protector in response to her evidence.
When the public protector gives evidence in chief through the chair, that there be a set of criteria to decide if chair can either compel her to answer immediately or allow for her to answer or to consult with her counsel first.
Another member felt the suspended public protector and her defense team were subjected to snide remarks by some members.
One honorable member said it seems as if he's going to be playing a delay tactic and is going to stall the process. You know, something in my view that was uncalled for, and it showed that that member is somewhat biased towards the public protector and Advocate Mpofu. So if there was fairness from your side, you would deal with such, snide remarks that, erode the confidence that the public ought to have that this indeed will be a fair process.
While there are still legal disputes that are being ironed out behind the scenes, the inquiry is due to meet again in the middle of next week. Meanwhile, Mkhwebane will also challenge her suspension by President Cyril Ramaphosa in the High Court in Cape Town on Monday. Ulilani Philip, SABC News, Parliament.
Well, I'm now joined by Mr. Mpumelelo Zikalala, who from Zikalala Attorneys. Good evening, sir. Thanks very much for your time. And I think the point of really playing that very comprehensive piece by Bulelani from most, if not all, the political parties, that have been participating. It was really to, let them raise all these concerns, because remember today, they didn't call any witnesses, but they were now they're raising all manner of issues that they had. Just from where you're sitting, what caught your attention from some of the issues that were being raised there as being problematic during the course of this process?
Good evening to you and also to the SABC listeners. I think this raises the question of let me call it the real true meaning of what this committee is about and the real character of this particular committee. They've said time and time and again that they're not a court of law, they're not a quasi-judicial process, they're simply an inquiry. However, in their essence and form, they are really a quasi-judicial process, and there should be rules in which such things should be assessed. Now, what they were doing today were inherently discussing and determining whether the evidence that has been provided thus far is credible or not, whether it should be believed or not, whether the witnesses that are there, their character and whatever else that is attributed to the truthness of the evidence that has been provided should be considered and accepted by the committee. Now, that is the job of an adjudicator. And the problem that you are going to find in this case is that since some of the committee members have got voting rights, so they've all turned into adjudicators, and they're busy adjudicating the matter as it is moving along. Whilst they haven't heard or the response of the public protector comprehensively, either verbally or in the written submissions in which she's going to submit at a later stage. This is the type of problem in which we are going to find, and these are the types of grounds in which the aggrieved party, in this case, if the public protector loses this particular inquiry, will take this matter to court and say to the court, look at how these adjudicators were not being independent. They were always biased towards their thinking, while evidence was still processed and while it wasn't in its entirety. They've already taken sides in terms of what is there. They can't even distinguish between robust cross-examination and cross-examination that should happen. So being called a liar is some assertion that you should make as a legal practitioner to someone who's giving evidence. And it is up to them to then rebut those particular insinuations or that allegations by quoting instances in which they've spoken the truth. There's nothing wrong with that. It's been robust in the cross-examination that is taking place.
Now, so they ought to, have paid perhaps more attention to formulating, crafting rules that would make sure that their process is not only credible, but whoever makes whatever case is a watertight one. But because what some of them were raising were, in fact, had to do with how Advocate Dalimpofu, who represents the public protector, questioned the cross-examined witnesses. Some of the MPs saying, didn't like the way he handled himself. And mind you, this came about as a result of the public protector saying that she needed, remember there was this whole big issue ahead of this, that whether or not she was entitled to legal representation. Could that not be?
I think that would have been the first flaw or the first mistake of the committee of saying that we're not going to offer legal representation. Now, in any judicial process in which the merits of the matter are going to be assessed, a person should be afforded legal representation. At the end of the day, the results which are going to be taken or the decision which is going to be taken by this particular committee has certain repercussions for the public protector, either good or bad. In the instances in which it is bad, history would be made. She's going to be the first public protector to be booted out of office. And with that, what's going to happen in terms of the credibility? What's going to happen if she then wants to take this matter to court for review? So at the end of the day, they can't run away from the fact that the process in which they have followed it is quasi-judicial, and to err on the safe side of the law and to make sure that the process is credible. All that they should have done is to say, let us use this quasi-judicial process in order to, at the end of the day, come back to making sure that this inquiry is the correct one. To use another example, let's take the State Capture Commission, for example. The rules in which the State Capture Commission was using is similar to what you would find in a court of law. There are certain allegations that are made, you are given a right to respond, and then there's cross-examination that takes place, you come back and you rebut all those things. There are no insinuations which are done or stated during the particular cross-examination or during the process, and a final decision is made only after all the evidence has been assessed. That's the exact same process they should have followed. Now, to come back and muddy the process that is happening now, it simply shows that the parliamentary committee maybe was ill-advised. They weren't advised properly in terms of saying, in order for us to have this credible process so that it is found to be above board and to be beyond approach, when we are taken to court on review basis, let's make sure that the methodology which is going to be used is one which will be able to suffice independent, correct evaluation of the evidence which is going to be provided, but most importantly, give the person who is an interested party in this particular process enough time to respond and also legal representation.
And what about, MPs? I mean, I'm not casting any aspersions, here on people or their sort of knowledge and understanding of, certain things. But I mean, there were. I mean, from the comments, there were suggestions that because an allegation was once leveled, against somebody, and therefore they automatically, the suggestion went, don't qualify to be witnesses in a process like this. Surely that can be, correct.
You're correct, and you see, it speaks directly to this element of biasness and the perception that one would have at the end of the day in terms of assessing whether information they are supposed to consume, sort of decipher, and then at the end of the day come back with the conclusion. Or already they've decided that this is the manner in which this particular process must go. For me, the first flow comes from the complainant themselves. In this case, we have a person who is the complainant and who's also the presiding officer or the judicial officer or the adjudicator in the same matter. In this case, if I'm correct, it's a Democratic Alliance that made this particular complaint. And yes, you find representatives from the Democratic Alliance sitting in the same committee. Now, where is the level of biasness or the insinuated unbiasedness that should be there from a person who's being the complainant and also the person who's been complained about? So if I go into a committee that has already decided they wouldn't have made this particular complaint if they believe that the public protector was innocent, or if they believe that the public protector was competent to do a job and there were no elements of misconduct in which is leveled against the public protector. Okay. So already they are filling in the missing pieces at the end of the day. So it's not going to make a difference. In order for them to save this particular process, in order for it to be authentic, then they needed to make sure that they adopt rules so that at the end of the day, if they want to assess the merits of the matter, they must then come back and bring it closer to that of a judicial process. If they don't do that, then it's going to be muddied with all these allegations at the end of the day.
Mpumelelo Mkhaya, let me thank you so much for your time and for your insights this evening. He's from Zikalala Attorneys on a day, of course, that the committee looking into the public protector's fitness to hold office took a break, but also took stock of what has happened up until now. And that's our show for tonight. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.